Hey folks, so we are moving on to chapter 12, how to work with HTML tables. Okay, I always like to talk about the importance of a topic before I cover the topic. Why is this important? And the most relevant answer I can give to that is that a lot of information that we work with and display on a web page, a lot of that information is stored in something called a database. Okay. You've probably heard of the term database. In third semester and even second semester, we'll begin to cover databases. And so we'll store information in this place called the database. And databases store information ultimately in tables. And so behind the web page is this information storage unit container that stores a lot of information, usernames and passwords and logs and successful login attempts and images and videos, and databases store all the information. All right. It's just millions of rows of information that can be stored in databases. And so when information is stored in a database, a lot of times you pull that information out and display that information since in the database they're stored in tables, it is very common to pull information out of a database and display it in a table um, on your page. And so why are working with tables important? Well, because in the real world, when we're working with real information, it's somewhat common to display that information in tables in our HTML. And so modernly, right, we display tabular data in HTML tables. Okay, so in the old days, we used to use tables actually for page layout. And when I say the old days, I'm talking the 90s. Okay, now we use CSS for page layout. So we don't use HTML tables for page layout like we did in the 90s. In the 90s, the entire page, you know, uh, for layout would be an HTML table. And if you wanted something in the up left-hand corner, you would place upper left-hand corner of the page, you would place that element in that table cell to get it to go in the upper left-hand corner. And if that wasn't specific enough, as if the placement in the cell wasn't specific enough, you would have nested tables. So you would have tables inside of tables to position things. And as we know, we don't want to bloat our HTML with extra tags and extra um, unnecessary elements, because that makes our HTML file larger, which slows down our page load time. And so we want to take out anything that's not there for structural purposes, like header tags and footer tags, or semantic purposes, and just use the layout. Use CSS for layout. We don't use HTML tables for layout anymore. And so this chapter, although tables is an important topic, it's not super technical. It's really a handful of tags. Nothing really, in my opinion, overly difficult. So the difficulty I think for this chapter will come down a little bit. Just a little bit of practice with tables is a good thing. We will learn how to merge table cells. We'll work with captions and headers and footers, and so there's table headers and table footers and things of that nature. And so we'll work with some pseudo classes in our CSS to format the tables and so that every other row could look a certain way. Um, we'll review this figure and figure caption, fig caption elements um, to work with a table as a figure. Some accessibility tips for tables and media queries. Um, as we're learning Bootstrap, we're going to figure out also how to do tables in Bootstrap as well. That'll be another lecture though. Okay, so again, why do we use tables? We use tables for tabular data. So information that looks good to be displayed in rows and columns. Um, and so, we just got some basic formatting here with, the colors that are going on and, making the headers bold and making the footer bold and everything in the cells looks to be centered. And so, yes, there's going to be HTML for this, and yes, there's going to be CSS for this. And so, even though this really doesn't look too complex, um, there's a fair amount of code that goes on behind the scenes. And so, um, I think in chapter 3, I had you guys do Code Academy, and you learned a little bit about tables in Code Academy. And so, really, you've seen this before, and so you know that the container tag for a table is table. So this is going to be up at the top of your code, and then at the bottom there's a closing table tag. So the important tags are the table tag. There's a table row. So each new row is done with a TR tag. And then if it's the first row, you can see the first row here, it's typical in a table to have headings. In other words, what is in this column? Well, in this column, this is the title of the book, and this column is the year, and this is the sales amount. So for the first row, we put a TH tag, and that's going to tell the browser that this is a table heading, a TH. And basically what that does is it makes it bold, right? But it's also there for semantic purposes to tell the developers of, hey, this is the information that's in that column. Okay, so the first row is typically done with a bunch of TH tags. Then every row after that is the TD, the table data, right? This is an actual cell of information. You'll notice they have a class of left, and what that's going to do is it's going to pull the text to be left aligned instead of centered. Okay, so that's all that does. And then each row after that is just another TR tag. So really the new tags here is the table tag, the TR, the TH, and the TD. Kind of looking here at the very last row, we've got, in this case, we wanted a cell to be bold. So even though it's at the bottom, this total sales, they put a TH tag to essentially get that to be it's not a piece of information essentially. Since it's not a piece of information, TH makes it bold, and it's also there more as a label as opposed to a piece of data, right? So if you think of this, these are all labels: book label, year published, sales, total sales. Everything else in here is a piece of information relevant to this table. So that's why they put this TH down at the bottom, is that this is just more of a label, is a way to look at it. If you put that table without any CSS formatting, this is what it's going to look like. Everything's left aligned, there's no borders, there's no colors, and so we're going to use a little bit of CSS to get it to go from kind of like the default look into something that looks a little bit more appealing, right? In HTML5, they introduced a header, a body, and a footer. And what goes up at the top is a T head. The core of the table is in T body. And then what goes at the bottom is the T foot. Again, these are just semantic tags that break up the table into different pieces. Um, it also helps, for styling purposes. Uh, you know, Not just semantically breaking these up, but it's like, okay, well, I want the T head to be styled a certain way. I want the T body to be styled a certain way, or the footer to be styled a certain way. So that's probably the most beneficial thing for us as to why would we use these tags, T head, T body, and T foot, is so that we can target these areas in our CSS and style them differently. Now, when it comes to CSS, we're going to be looking at these CSS properties: border collapse, border spacing, padding is pretty normal, text align, left, center, right, vertical align. So these are some properties that we'll be working with. Border collapse is one that kind of sticks out in my mind. Um, that Probably border collapse and border spacing are going to be the new things here. Padding, text align, and vertical align we've covered before, and we just apply these to tables. But these are the new ones in this chapter. And so, here we're just looking at some pretty standard CSS. Um, Border collapse, collapse. What happens is on the table, when you turn all of your borders on, um, each cell and each row has its own border, and those borders stay separate from one another. And so you end up drawing a bunch of cells that aren't, they don't really look like a unified table. And so when you do this border collapse property, instead of having two different borders, for example, this PHP in MySQL would have a right border, and this 2017 cell would have a left border, and they wouldn't be combined together. They wouldn't collapse together. And so to get those two borders, the right border on this cell and the left border on this cell to essentially be one border, that's where the border collapse comes into play, right? So here's a table without collapse borders, right? And so pretty commonly you look at this and go, well, I'd rather have my table look like this, right? And so to do that, the solution is border collapse with the value of collapse. So that's one new CSS value. Now, the other thing that we cover here is border spacing. So if your borders aren't collapsed, there's a default spacing between borders. And by changing the border spacing property, you can increase or decrease how much space is in between these cells. Okay, more than likely you're just going to do border collapse. So that's the little bit of nuance that's new here, and that's um, the way that tables work out of the box. And so some of these CSS selectors that we can use, nth child, to say, okay, well, I want to select the third table row. You would do nth child 3, and that would select this particular row, right? So nth child on the tr tag, so it would look like tr nth child 3, and then you could apply your CSS to do background of red. For example, this would be how you would use the nth child to get this third row, to a different background color. So nth child is a very common one as far as pseudo selectors go. Nth last child. So the last child would say, okay, we've got, 5 table rows. It's just another way of selecting, like, for example, a table row. If you got 5 table rows inside of a table, you could select the last table row or the second to last or the third to last table row. It's just another way of selecting elements inside of a parent. So the parent would be table, and that would be the third to last child inside of the table. Um, you could say nth of type, and so this doesn't have to necessarily be a child, right? So this is the child of something, but nth of type does not have to be. So this would just be the, fifth paragraph on the page. It doesn't have to be a child of anything. And last of type. So these are really just some pseudo selectors that really get you into the nitty gritty of selecting individual elements. And what I would recommend just for the practice of it is, coding each one of these in a document and, changing the background color. And we can also, besides doing like the third element, we could do, okay, all the odd rows or all the even rows. N would be like the third element in here. So here's a few examples of the first table heading, the first table data. We do the text align left. So the first table heading, first table data, the second table heading child, the second table data child, and then here's a good one. Every table row that's an even table row, so it's, uh, obviously the 2, 4, 6. I don't know. I don't think it counts 0 as even, but it might. It might count the 0 row. I don't think it does. I think it starts at, the count starts at 1, and then it's every other. So that's how you change every other row background color to silver. And so part of your homework tonight is going to be to practice using these pseudo selectors to get a table styled like this. Okay, and again, the homework is pretty much right out of the book, just kind of taking some tables in the book and formatting them like the book has them. So just a little practice with tables. If you wanted to, as they did with images, you could have a figure and a fig caption with tables, and so you can kind of see that this table heading, total sales by book, could be inside of a figure, and then you have the fig caption up top, and then you have the table underneath it. Excuse me. And so, um, again, I don't think anything's overly complex here. Probably the most complex thing here in this chapter is going to be practice with all these child selectors um, in our CSS. Otherwise, nothing really too difficult here. Um, then they, apply some custom CSS, saying, okay, the figure is 450 pixels wide. The fig caption is display block, so that the caption, the table is underneath the caption. A table with merged cells. So if we're looking at this, the one cell that's merged that you can kind of see here definitely is this sales row. And so you can see this row right here. I also see the word book is taking up 2 rows. So sales is taking up 4 columns. The word sales is taking up 4 columns. The word book is taking up 2 rows. So if we look at the word book, you could see that it's taking up 2 rows. That's done with a row span attribute. And this is an older, this has been around in HTML for a long time. So row span, the word sales takes up 4 columns, And you can see this is inside of our table. We've got our header, and then the first row, we've got the word book. So that's our first cell essentially, book, and it takes up 2 rows. And then we've got, after that, we've got the word sales, which takes up 4 columns. So that's how we do merge cells. Merge cells is done with HTML attributes, col span and row span. And to get some CSS targeting for those cells, well, the first table head, vertical align bottom, that's going to be for the word book. That's how we get the book alignment of that text to be at the bottom of that cell. And the second child, text align center, that's the second child, which is a table heading. So basically the second table heading, text align center. And then we say the second table row, table heading. So the table heading inside of the second row, text align right. So that's all 1, 2, 3, 4 of those. Those are all table headings that are in the second row. So it pulls the word north, south, west, and total over to the right. So text align right. When it comes to accessibility, there's a couple of things for tables to help us out with screen readers. There's a caption tag. Of course, the screen reader would read this out loud, and it would understand that it belongs to a table. And then after that, you can apply information in attributes. So for example, we'll just take this individual column. So the book column. The book column, we give it an ID of header book, and we say it's a column. Therefore, every piece of data that belongs to that column, header book, is tied in through the ID and through the header attribute. And so a screen reader would help to read the information by understanding where the columns are aligned. And you might think, well, it's pretty obvious, but maybe not, because when you're merging rows and you're merging columns, it might not be obvious to a screen reader what piece of information belongs to a column, right? So by giving this column an ID and saying all 4 of these cells belong to that column, it'll help with the screen reader to explain the information inside of the table to the end user. You can have nested tables, and so it can become fairly complex, where you've got almost like in our nav bars, where we had unordered lists inside of unordered lists inside of unordered lists. And to do that, you had an unordered list, and then you had a line item, and then inside of that line item, you had an unordered list. Then what you have here is you've got a table cell, and inside of a table cell, you open up another table. So here's the table cell, the TD, and then inside of that, we have a nested table. So if it's necessary, it can be done. The markup becomes a little bit more challenging when you do that. So if it's not necessary, I wouldn't recommend it. But you might come across a scenario where you find that it's necessary for more precise displaying of the information to have nested tables. Um, Table with wrapping and without wrapping, you can kind of see here that once you shrink a table with wrapping becomes a little bit more responsive, and then a table without wrapping, it kind of stays more of a fixed. Um, and so the way to um, turn off wrapping is to tell the table selector white space no wrap. And so if you don't want it to be responsive, you can turn that off that way. You know, more than likely that's not going to be what you want. More than likely you're going to have this in some sort of fluid container and you want it to respond. But you can turn that off. And with media queries, we can change our table uh, to be formatted differently. It looks like we just have a lot of things displaying block. And so you take what you know about media queries and you tell the table heads and the table datas to display block. And that's going to help us get all of these cells on top of one another so it looks a certain way inside of a mobile view. And again, we have bootstrap tables that will help us with all of that as well. Well, folks, that was a 30-minute lecture. We're going to call that the quickest one ever. I, uh, I didn't want to take forever on this one, and really not too many code examples that I did during the lecture. Typically, I like to do more code examples, but I think these are tables that are straightforward enough that I'll even tell you honestly, historically, there were times where I didn't even cover tables in this class because most people can just kind of figure them out when they need to. But you know, we're doing okay as far as time wise it goes in this class. I did want to cover them and kind of the some of the styling, some of the things that can help us style our tables, and also to just practice them a little bit. I think is a good thing to do so that we at least cover them, we touch on them, and then we can move on pretty quickly. The fastest lecture in the Midwest. Okay, I'm gonna stop the lecture here, and next we're gonna cover Bootstrap, lecture 2.